Me, I'm on the left side of value systems, collectives, public goods, full employment, those type of things. My policy set that I'll apply will be very different to, say, another person who's on the right of the political spectrum who has a completely same understanding as me of the way the system operates, but of course applies that to totally different set of policies. So it's really important to understand that. It's about the way in which the system operates, and it theorises and describes and explains the way the system operates. Okay, now to the first slide. What do we mean when we talk about currency sovereignty? That's a very particular state. And what that means is that it's a government that issues its own currency as a monopolist. So the only issuer of the Australian dollar is the federal government, and the federal government is the central bank, the RBA, and the Treasury Department. That's a unique capacity. It floats it on the international markets. That means that it doesn't peg it to any other currency or any other commodity. Its central bank, the RBA, undoubtedly sets the interest rate and has total discretion over that. It can set it at any rate it wants and can maintain that rate. So the market doesn't set the interest rate. And a sovereign government never issues any liabilities in a foreign currency. Now, what does that then lead to? That then leads to the initial insight that if you have your own currency, which the Australian government does, then it faces no intrinsic financial constraint. Now, what does that mean? That means it can buy whatever's for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. And once you get to that first little step, you immediately have one very major conclusion, that if there's mass unemployment, it must be a policy choice. Which is one of the most shameful professions in the world, has all of this obfuscation about why there's unemployment, and typically they'll revert back to their neoliberal DNA and start talking about lazy workers subsidised by excessive income support, unemployment benefits, and don't want to work and all of those things. But mass unemployment is because the government always has the financial capacity to provide jobs for anybody who wants them. That's one of the big first insights from not having a financial constraint. Now, that separates the currency issuing government from you and me, because if we want to spend, we have to fund that spending. We have to get up in the morning and say, well, we'll go to work. I'm at work right now talking to you. Or we have to draw down our savings from prior savings, or we have to sell an asset on eBay to get money, or we have to borrow if those other sources of funding are deficient relative to our spending ambitions. And that's particularly when we're younger and buy a very large asset like a house. Now, in that context, the household is financially constrained, but the federal government is not like that at all. And while we continually are encouraged and indoctrinated to apply our experience as households to our understanding of what the government can do and what the capacities of the government can do, the reality is that experience as households gives us no knowledge at all about the government. The government has no financial constraint, and that's not the same thing that it doesn't have a constraint, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So the big challenge for a currency issuing government is how to provision itself. How does it, and we're talking about what are called fiat currencies here. Fiat currencies have no intrinsic value. Commodity-based currencies are backed by gold or silver or something like that, but the Australian dollar is just declared to be the currency by legislative fiat. It has no intrinsic value. And so the question is, well, what makes us want to use that currency? And this relates to what we call the challenging provision of the public sector. So let's think about that. The first thing that the government has to do to elicit what the provisioning challenge is about is, how does the government that owns no resources get the private sector who owns all the resources to transfer those resources into the public sector so that the government can then run its service delivery mandate and its infrastructure building and its programs, because it's got to work out a way. And the only way that can do that is buy the resources from the private non-government sector and get them to work in the public sector. Well, how do they actually make us do that? Short of slavery, of course, in a free market type system. Well, the way they do it is to impose a tax liability in the currency that they are the sole issuers of. Now, that's one of the other capacities of a currency issuing government. It can declare anything that will be able to be used to relinquish our tax liabilities to it. And the Australian dollar is the only way that can happen for us. We have to get the Australian dollar so that we can pay our taxes. And so the tax liability then allows the government to spend into the non-government sector and procure resources and have those resources transferring into government programs. And then what follows next is the ability of us to pay our taxes. Now that schema is very important, because as you'll see in a moment when we do some arithmetic, the tax payments cannot possibly fund the spending. They come after the spending. The spending has to come first before we can pay the taxes. So let's go back to primary school, and here's a little sort of a set of accounts, and we've got government on the left-hand side, and above the area of bonds, outstanding financial wealth are flows. They're flows of currency, and below is the balance sheets. So I'll explain all this as we go. So let's say in year one, and we've divided it between the government and the non-government. What's the non-government? It's households, firms, and external sector. Now, we don't have to get into complications yet about the external sector. So this will give you this little example that we're going to run through gives you some really key insights. And it might seem simple, but it's very easy to extrapolate up into the real world. So the government wants to run some programs. It's got to get some labour that we have in the non-government sector to work in the public sector. So it announces it'll pay $100 in wages. Now, this could be 100 million, doesn't matter, it's simple arithmetic here. And so immediately in year one, the non-government sector, that's us, has employment and wages equal to 100. Now, the government announces also in advance that we've got to pay $100 worth of taxes. And so the causality goes like this. The government spends 100 by hiring us and improving employment. We earn 100 in wages, which then allows us to get $100 to pay the taxes. Note those red lines are telling you about causality. And that causality is going from spending through to tax payments. It's not going the other way. Now, at the end of year one, the non-government sector hasn't been able to accumulate any dollars as saving because we've forced them to pay all of its income in taxes. And the fiscal injection, the balance between spending and taxes, is zero. In other words, we're neither running a fiscal deficit, which is the difference between spending and taxes, nor a fiscal surplus. We've got a perfectly balanced fiscal position. All right. And you should be starting to see some principles emerging here. the non-government sector can't save in the currency of issue if the government has a balanced fiscal position. Okay, let's go to year 2. The government decides it wants to expand public programs and expand employment. So now they're spending 120 on wages. Income's gone up to 120 in the non-government sector. Taxes have remained at 100. Note the causality again. And at the end of year 2, look what's happened. The non-government sector now has income of 120, but it's only had to pay 100 back in taxes. So it's been able to save $20 of currency. And the fiscal injection is plus 20. In other words, the government has spent 120, it's only received 100 back in taxes, so it's been running a deficit of 20. And look at the relationship. The government's deficit of 20 has allowed the non-government to accumulate savings in the currency, the government's currency, of equal amount of 20. And if you go down to the bottom part of the table, you'll see now that financial wealth in the non-government sector has gone up by cash holdings of 20. So the principle here is that the fiscal deficit in any year adds that much to non-government sector saving. Let's go on. Hoping you're enthralled by all this, these insights. So spending now has been maintained. The government wants to maintain that level of employment and that level of program delivery. And so in year 3, we get, again, another flow of 120, 120 income in wages, taxes paid 100, deficit in year 3, another deficit of 20. And in year 3, the non-government sector, that's us, has been able to accumulate a further 20 currency units for saving. And look what's happened to our financial wealth. It's doubled now. It's gone up to 40. Now, this is a really important next step, because the government decides that, look, it's unfair to force the non-government sector to hold all of its wealth in cash, which earns no interest. So why don't we encourage the saving and the frugality and the risk management in the non-government sector? Why don't we offer them a debt instrument, a bond, an interest-earning bond, and let's say the interest is going to be 10% per year, and we'll offer that portfolio choice to the non-government sector. Now, in this example, the non-government sector has decided that earning interest is better than not earning interest. It doesn't need any cash for short-term emergencies. And so it's transferred all of its financial wealth into government bonds. So now it's holding its portfolio of prior savings in government bonds. And those prior savings are accumulated fiscal deficits. Now, there's one important other thing, and you've got to think about this a little bit, because that 40 under the bonds outstanding is what we call national debt. That's public debt. That's what everybody worries about who doesn't understand this stuff. Now, you think very carefully now about where that debt came from. In effect, the government was borrowing back the accumulated fiscal deficits of the prior 2 years. It was borrowing its own money back. Moreover, you can think about it as the national debt is just past deficits that haven't been taxed away yet. That's the only way that 40 could have occurred. So the government, it's what we call a wash in financial markets. The government's really creating the funds that the non-government sector then are able to use as accumulated saving to buy the debt as a portfolio choice between whatever financial assets they hold. In the real world, there's complicated choices about how you hold the wealth portfolio. But it's the same principle as here. All right. Now the IMF enters the picture, and everybody's freaking out, and all these mainstream economists are going in the Australian and in the Financial Review and on the TV and raving on about how this government's living well beyond its means. It's going to run out of money. It's going to cause inflation. It's going to drive up interest rates. Everyone freaks out. And the IMF says that the government's going to go broke. And so the government becomes ultra neoliberal and decides to impose fiscal austerity. So in year 4, you can see the austerity. It decides to cut public sector spending, and in this case, employment. And so wages are cut back to 76. Because the outstanding debt was 40 and we're earning 10% on that, and it's very high in today's environment, but it's arithmetic, the government has to pay $4 in interest payments to the holders of that debt. And so non-government sector income falls. You can see that. In other words, unemployment starts to rise. Output starts falling. Activity falls. Public sector service delivery, the scope and declines. And the government doesn't alter the sort of tax requirement on the non-government sector. Still has to pay 100, yet it's only earned in year 4, 80. Now, the question you should be asking is, well, how does it do that? Well, you'll note that in year 4, overall saving is minus 20 because it's only earned 80, the non-government sector. It's paying the government 100, and you'll note that the fiscal injection is now minus 20. In other words, it's a surplus. And I'm deliberately putting negatives for surpluses and positives for deficits because of their impact upon financial wealth in the non-government sector. So that surplus now of 20, because spending's 20 less than the taxes of 100, puts a liquidity squeeze on the non-government sector, who's now got a negative saving of minus 20. Well, how does the non-government sector fund that negative saving? Well, the only way it can do it is by selling some bonds back. So its financial wealth declines to fund the liquidity squeeze that the government has imposed upon them by the surplus. And so what you understand is that deficits increase financial wealth in the non-government sector, surpluses destroy it. So when Peter Costello was raving on from 1996 to 2007, 10 surpluses out of 11, saying we're getting the debt monkey off our back, we're stopping the interest burden on the on households and firms, etc. What he really was saying was that he's destroying our wealth and destroying over time our income flow from interest earned from our wealth. That's the reality. And then, of course, it could go on from there. So what did we learn? Government deficit spending adds exactly that amount to non-government income. And then we have multiplier effects that expand on that. Fiscal deficits always fund the non-government sector desire to save and therefore fill the spending gap that the savings leaves. And government surpluses always, dollar for dollar, result in an equal decline in non-government wealth, our wealth. Now, they're fundamental principles that almost nobody understands. And they're absolutely intrinsic to cutting through all of the mainstream myths that then constrain the politicians in advancing well-being for all of us. And you'll know they note that when there's a war to be fought or when the bank's in danger, there's no one asks how we're going to pay for it. They just transfer the money. Whereas when someone wants to increase unemployment benefits or help a disadvantaged community with proper social housing, it's always we can't afford it, we'll run out of money, or will cause inflation. Well, all spending, whether it's consumption, business investment, government spending, export spending coming in, all of that carries an inflation risk. So think about these two scenarios. The first one is where this sovereign government, which we've described, faces an economy that's in full employment. What does that mean? All the current productive resources are being used. Now, if the government then wants to, say, pursue a green transition program, which will require a massive transformation in production and consumption patterns, which will also require a substantial increase in the public presence in the use of productive resources. If it wants to do that and the economy is already at full employment, then it has to compete for those resources in existing users for transfer into the public sector for their use. Now, if it does that at market prices, by offering contracts and competing on price, then you reach a constraint. Not a financial constraint, because the government can buy whatever's available for sale. It can spend as much, put as many zeros as it like. And remember, governments spend every single day of the year by getting the Reserve Bank to type numbers in the bank accounts. That's how governments spend. Irrespective of what else, they are continually typing numbers. They can type whatever numbers with as many zeros as they want, and that would be spending, and it would go through to the banking system. But in the case that I've just outlined, this scenario one, the constraint that the government spending comes up against is an inflation constraint, because if it pushes spending faster, then the productive system can respond. And if it tries to compete for resources that are already in use, then it can cause inflation. Now, how does it cope then if it wants to increase the size of government, which means increasing the use of productive resources? Well, it has to work out a way to deprive the existing users of those resources of being able to use them. Now, it can do that in a number of ways, regulation and what have you, but the substantial way it does it is by imposing taxes. Here's the clue as to why a government that has no financial constraint still imposes taxes. Well, what do taxes do? They do a lot of things, but in this context, they deprive us of purchasing power. And if we have less purchasing power, we can buy less resources. Using less resources, we can buy less goods and services, and that means productive resources are then not being used that might otherwise be used. So the trick is that if you're at full employment and the government wants to expand its resource use, it hits the real resource constraint, and the only way it can get around that is by freeing up some resources through taxation. The taxation isn't funding the spending. We've already worked that out. It doesn't fund the spending. It provides the resource space, the real resource space, in which governments can spend without causing inflation. That's the constraint on government spending. Take scenario 2 briefly, an economy like now. Massive idle resource capacity. In that situation, the government has no constraint at all on its spending. It has no financial constraint by definition, and there are all these idle resources that have what we call zero bid in the market. What's that mean? Nobody wants to hire them. They're sitting idle with no price in the market, in which case the government can bring those productive resources into productive use via spending and keep driving that spending up to the point at which we get back to scenario 1, when all those resources are being productively used. at which case the inflation constraints hits. So it's really important to understand that the way we think typically about government spending is completely mythical. It's a fictional world. And it's been deliberately created like that to provide a discipline on government intervention and government action because, of course, the free marketeers and the neoliberals hate government intervention unless it's lining their own pockets. Broadly, they want smaller governments and what government there is should line their pockets. And so once you cut through that and understand that all the arguments they use there are just fallacious, then you've got totally different questions the politicians have to answer. They have to answer at the moment, in my view, why are you allowing probably 10 or 11% of your labour resources to be unemployed? The broad labour underutilisation rate in Australia is currently 18% as of last week. That means underemployment and unemployment. Between March and now, an additional 220-odd thousand workers have dropped out of the labour force altogether. They're hidden unemployed. There's no jobs, so why they don't satisfy the ABS activity test of surge. So you're up around 20, 21% of your willing and able labour resources that have not being used at all at the moment. And the government is penny pinching and saying we can't afford any more, all the debt, blah, blah. Well, the questions we can ask now that you're informed is why are you doing that? You've got as much currency capacity to bring those resources into use in one way or another. The federal government could right now pay all of the incomes of all of the workers if it wanted to. There'd be no problem at all. Let's just see what else I've got. Yeah, I think I'm just going to come to the last slide here because this second last one and the last one. Now, G is government spending, T is taxes. Now, it's really important then to understand that the fiscal balance can never be a reasonable policy target. So when our governments bore us stupid about, we're going to get into surplus. The surplus is the only thing to have. And they've got an obsession with that, both sides of politics, and a lot of trade unionists, by the way. When they do that, they're uttering nonsense because the government can't determine its final fiscal balance in any period. Why? Because we ultimately determine it, the non-government sector. Now, how does that work? Well, very briefly, the government can set discretionary policy settings, so it's tax parameters and its spending programs, and set about pursuing those. But what the ultimate fiscal outcome will be at the end of whatever period you want to talk about, that's conditioned by that discretionary spending, will depend upon our spending decisions. Why? Because if we decide to spend more in any period and save less, then the level of activity will increase. Tax revenue to the government will increase because that's linked to economic activity, principally employment. And welfare payments will decline because less people will be on unemployment benefits and other related welfare payments. And so, other things being equal, for a given policy setting, if we spend more than the government anticipated, then its deficit will be smaller or its surplus will be larger. If we spend less than the government anticipates when it sets its policy parameters, well, then the deficit will rise. Why? Because activity will be smaller, tax revenue will be less, and welfare payments will be larger. So it's nonsensical for the government to target a number. There's nothing about, you can't make any sense of just saying a 2% of GDP deficit is better than a 10% deficit of GDP, or a surplus of 2% is better than a 2% deficit. Those statements are nonsensical. Why? Because they are without context. Now, what does that mean? This is the last point. What do we want fiscal policy to do? It's not to achieve a particular number. That's just meaningless statement. It's not to have a particular debt ratio, because we've just learned that debt's not an issue. And the government doesn't even need to issue debt. Go back to that simple arithmetic. The government just could have left all of those accumulated savings in other financial assets and not given the non-government sector the portfolio choice to buy a government bond. The spending still would have occurred. The bonds don't fund the spending. The spending funded the bonds. That's the reality. And so the government could just type numbers into the bank accounts to facilitate its procurement and its payments agenda, and the Reserve Bank would just ratify all that. There'd be no problem. The currency would be transferred through the banking system, end of story. And even now, with the outstanding debt, the Reserve Bank's just bought $50 billion of it, by the way, in QE programs, quantitative easing programs. The Reserve Bank could buy any day it wanted to all the outstanding government debt and then type zero into the account against how much they bought, and nothing would happen at all. Our wealth would be less in that particular asset, and it would be more in another asset because we'd be paid for the debt. Nothing would happen. So the question is, what do we want fiscal policy to do? And this is my last point. Well, it's got to be in the context of what we are doing. Now, what we do is spend and save. Now, if you've got income, the basic rule of macroeconomics is spending equals income equals output. One person's spending is another person's income, dollar for dollar. Now, in any one period, business firms are expecting a certain amount of spending to be going on. And so they hire labour and assemble resources and produce a certain amounts of goods and services on that presumption. Now, if we don't recycle all of our income back in to spending and we decide to save some in the non-government sector, and the firms make a wrong guess about how much we're going to save, and let's say they guess that we'll save less than we actually do, well, then in that context, there will be a build-up of inventory unsold. They'll start laying off staff because they've produced too much, and you'll enter recession. So if the non-government sector wants to save overall, and I won't go into the additional complication here of if the external sector's in deficit, which means that some of the income produced in any year is going out of the spending system next period to the rest of the world. That's what an external deficit means. Well, in that context, if the government doesn't run a deficit and fill that spending gap left by the saving, then you'll get recession. And so in normal times, typically the government has to run continuous deficits to maintain full employment, to allow, and they're doing that so that they're providing enough spending and demand that the firms will produce goods and services and employ people, and that income that's generated will fund consumption, investment and saving in the non-government sector. And if the government tries to penny pinch and we're trying to save, and the government's trying to run a surplus by squeezing our liquidity, then we'll go into a slowdown and ultimately a recession. So the question is, how big should the deficit be? It should be large enough and continuous so that all the productive resources are fully employed and the savings desires of the non-government sector are realised. Now, the last thing about context before I hand it back, sometimes a fiscal surplus might be appropriate. How do I answer that question or make that assessment? I go back to the context of what the non-government sector is doing. So take a country like Norway. which runs a very large external surplus because of the North Sea energy resources, oil and gas. It's getting a massive amount of income flow coming into its economy from the rest of the world. It can provide first-class public services, maintain full employment, keep income growth at a level commensurate with the desire to save in the private domestic sector, households and firms, and still run a surplus. If it tried to run a deficit in that context, spending would hit the resource constraint that I mentioned before, the inflation constraint, and it would cause inflation. So the context is crucial. When anyone says to me, oh, a 2% deficit, that's outrageous, I say, well, in relation to what? What's the context? And sometimes a 10% deficit might be appropriate, sometimes a 2% surplus might be. But typically, given Australia's history, a small continuous deficit has been required to maintain full employment. And this period after 96, when Costello was running the surpluses, were atypical. So when you hear a politician or an economist say, we've got to get back to surplus, that was the only way the surpluses were possible was that the household saving ratio went from, say, 10, 12% to negative. And that was made, so the household stopped saving and they then went into continuous deficit by borrowing through the financial market deregulation and the credit boom. And that credit boom allowed them to keep spending, which kept the level of activity going to allow the federal government to run surpluses. But meanwhile, we were walking into an Armageddon of household debt. Household debt went from, say, 60% of household disposable income in the mid-80s to about nearly 200 now. And of course, 200, it's too precarious. Households eventually won't keep borrowing, and they're not now. The household saving ratio a couple of weeks ago went from, over the second quarter, went from 5% to 19% in one quarter. And that's because economic circumstances meant that record levels of household debt was unsustainable. So unlike government debt, which is of no problem, private sector debt has, of course, got to be serviced within a financial constraint. So don't ever let anyone tell you that we've got to get back to surplus because that's where we've been. Where we've been was abnormal and was a situation where the households were spending well beyond their means, accumulating unsustainable debt, which was always going to blow up if it's sustained. So that's the end of the talk. I'm going to stop sharing and then we can go to questions.
Great. Thanks a lot, Bill.
I hope that was of use. That's just a real introduction. It's obviously much more complicated than that. We haven't got an interest rate story there. We haven't got central bank sort of dynamics. We haven't got private sector banking in that talk I gave. But it's just the introduction to our work and what it means. But making it more complicated, introducing bank money, etc., doesn't change the fundamentals that I've given you today. And if you've understood what I've said tonight, then you're better informed than someone who's done a mainstream PhD in economics. True.
Oh, there you go. We've got a room full of them now.
I tell jokes, but that wasn't one of them.